This file is 3 centimeters thick. Brown cardboard cover. Typed name. A registration number in the upper right corner. 2 official stamps, slightly faded. It sits on a desk under flat fluorescent light. Not a dramatic room, just a reading room. Wood tables. Metal chairs. A clock that sounds louder than it should. Inside, there are reports. Conversation summarized. Habits recorded. Names of friends. Dates of meetings. Descriptions of ordinary evenings. The person this file is about never held it while it was being built. He never requested it. He never signed it. He never approved its contents. But it followed him. From university to employment. From apartment to apartment. From one decade to the next. The file did not need to be accurate. It needed to exist. Because existence creates behavior. A folder like this was not rare in the German Democratic Republic. The unusual part was the silence around it. You could walk past the building that stored these folders. You could stand in line for bread and never mention them. You could hear the word Stasi and say it softer than the radio. Most people did not know whether they had a file. They learned to live as if they might. And that is the first shock. Control that works without announcing itself. A file did not begin with a crime. It often began with a remark. A joke at work. A comment about shortages. A question about travel permissions. A complaint that sounded small, but pointed in the wrong direction. Someone would note it. Not always an officer. Often an ordinary person in an ordinary role. A colleague. A neighbor. Sometimes a friend. Sometimes someone who thought they were protecting a workplace, a school, a family. A short report is written. It is typed, dated, and placed into a folder. The folder receives a number. Numbers are easier to manage than suspicions. Then the file starts to grow the way paperwork grows anywhere. One page attracts another page. A record of a phone call. A summary of a conversation in a stairwell. A note that someone met a visitor from the West. A mention that someone listened too carefully when foreign music played. Small observations. Routine language. No theatrical accusations. The file thickens by accumulation, not by explosion. And the system loves accumulation because it creates a second reality. A person as paperwork. In the paperwork, ambiguity becomes a category. A hesitation becomes unreliable. A private frustration becomes negative attitude. A friendship becomes network. Once the person is converted into categories, the system can manage him the way it manages production quotas. Inputs, outputs, risks, controls. A folder is not just storage. It is a model. Surveillance is usually imagined as a camera. A microphone. A man in a coat. But in the GDR, the dominant mechanism was administrative. Files. Index cards. Registers. Cross-references. A quiet infrastructure of retrieval. The most important action was not watch. It was record. Because recording creates anticipation. By 1989, the Ministry for State Security, the Ministerium für Staatssicherheit, employed around 91,000 full-time officers. It also relied on roughly 189,000 informal collaborators. In a country of about 16 million people, that meant the system was not distant. It was distributed. The archive they built would eventually measure more than 110 kilometers of shelving. Not metaphorical kilometers. Measurable ones. People adjusted before punishment arrived. A teacher avoided certain topics. A factory worker limited complaints. A student selected safer research themes. Not because an officer stood beside them, but because the possibility existed that a line could be written. In apartment buildings, conversations lowered when unfamiliar footsteps entered the hallway. On telephones, pauses carried meaning. Not because every call was monitored, but because it might be. A person does not need proof of surveillance to change behavior. A person needs a believable mechanism. And the mechanism was believable because it was bureaucratic. Bureaucracy is persuasive. It looks permanent. It looks official. It looks like it has a drawer for you. The file did not have to be opened every day. Its existence altered decisions in advance. This is the difference between repression and administration. Repression reacts. Administration anticipates. Administration is quieter than force, and often more efficient. In a violent system, you fear the moment it hits you. In an administrative system, you fear the possibility that you are already inside it. And that fear does not need to be named. It only needs to be rehearsed. So people rehearse. They rehearse what to say at work. They rehearse what not to say at home. They rehearse which friends to keep close, and which to keep as acquaintances. They rehearse neutrality. Not because neutrality is safe. Because neutrality is hard to punish. The file teaches you how to become legible in the safest possible way. As unremarkable. That is the architecture of anticipation. The most important feature of a file is that it travels faster than a person. You apply for a new job, and a decision is made before an interview. Not explained. Not argued. Simply decided. You request permission to study in a different city. You are told the program is full. You apply for an apartment upgrade. The answer arrives late, vague, final. None of these moments announces surveillance. They announce administration. A file allows the system to act without confronting you. It does not have to accuse you to limit you. It only has to recommend. And recommendations can be written in the calmest language. Not suitable. Not reliable. Not prioritized. The power is in the tone. It is not angry. It is institutional. That tone is what makes resistance expensive. You can protest a policeman. You cannot argue with a form. The file makes every decision look like a routine outcome of procedure. And procedure is difficult to fight because it pretends to be impersonal. In films, an informant is a character. In a surveillance bureaucracy, an informant is a workflow. A report has a format. A date line. A place. A short summary. A list of names. It is submitted. It is reviewed. It is copied. It is filed. Sometimes it is cross-filed. The goal is not one perfect revelation. The goal is a steady stream. A system built on paperwork does not want drama. Drama is hard to archive. Routine is easy. So the system trains people to write routine. To describe a gathering in the same language every time. To note who spoke first. Who laughed? Who stayed late? Who mentioned travel? Who asked about prices? Who compared anything to the West? When you read these reports later, they feel repetitive. That repetition is not a flaw. It is the point. Repetition creates pattern. Pattern creates risk. Risk justifies further documentation. The file grows because the system is designed to grow files. The folder is still on the table. Another page has been added. The metal fastener bends slightly to accommodate it. The cardboard edges darken where hands have touched it. 3 centimeters is not an accident. It is the result of routine. When the person from the beginning finally sees his file, he expects a headline. A single sentence that explains everything. He does not find one. He finds continuity. A stack of small notes, each one individually unimpressive. Arranged into a biography the system wrote without permission. A conversation turned into a paragraph. A mood turned into a category. A friend turned into an influence. The file reads like a life scene from the side. Not through intimacy. Through relevance. It does not record joy. It records deviation. It does not record love. It records contact. It does not record who you are. It records who you might become if the wrong interpretation is correct. And that is the final shock. The file is not only about the past. It is about the future the system was trying to prevent. A file like this contains 2 kinds of material. First, observation. Dates. Places. Who arrived? Who left? A report that someone attended a gathering. A note that someone received a letter. Second, interpretation. What the observer thinks the event meant. Interpretation is where the system expands. Because interpretation converts life into ideology. A casual remark becomes hostility. A private doubt becomes political weakness. A disagreement becomes influence. The file is not a mirror. It is a translation. And translation is never neutral. It is shaped by incentives. By career safety. By fear of being accused of missing a threat. By the need to show productivity. By the need to justify the work. A report that says nothing happened is not useful. A report that finds meaning in something small is useful. So meaning is manufactured. Not in speeches. In paragraphs. And once those paragraphs are stamped and filed, they become harder to argue with than a rumor. Paper has authority. Even when it is wrong. In 1989, the border opened. And soon after, citizens entered Stasi offices. They did not look for weapons. They looked for paper. Rooms filled with metal shelves. Rows of brown folders. Handwritten labels. Index cards arranged in drawers. When offices were occupied, people formed lines not for food, but for access. They wanted a receipt. A confirmation that their name existed somewhere on a shelf. Some entered and did not speak. They just looked at the cabinets, the drawers, the labels. Because drawers are a kind of proof. A rumor can be denied. A slogan can be mocked. A drawer full of index cards cannot be argued away. Later, when the new authorities created a process for citizens to request their files, the waiting itself became part of the story. Forms were filled. Identity was verified. Weeks passed. Then an envelope arrived. Not a dramatic envelope. A plain one. Inside were copies, sometimes with sections blacked out. Sometimes with codes instead of names. Sometimes with missing pages that had been destroyed. But even the missing pages told a truth. Someone had hurried to erase something. And even the erasure was administrative. Shredded paper. Bags. Labels. Storage rooms. A bureaucracy trying to undo itself with the same tools it used to exist. Some files had been shredded in haste. Later, volunteers would reconstruct fragments by hand. When individuals requested access to their own records, they encountered something unexpected. Detail. Descriptions of clothing. Tone of voice. Private frustrations. A list of friends that looked like a map. And sometimes, handwriting they recognized. The shock was not simply that the state watched. Most people suspected that. The shock was how normal the watching looked on paper. How routine. How procedural. A life broken into entries. The thickness became measurable. 3 centimeters. 5. 10. The file did not only record suspicion. It recorded identity, as the system preferred to understand it. 3 centimeters is not heavy. It fits easily inside one hand. But multiplied across a society, it becomes architecture. Shelves. Buildings. Institutions. Budgets. Careers. A state can run on slogans. But it stabilizes itself through procedures. A road system tells you where movement is allowed. A file system tells you where life is allowed. One controls bodies. The other controls possibilities. And possibilities are where most people live. Not in heroic moments. In applications, permissions, appointments, waiting rooms. That is why a 3 centimeter folder matters. It is small enough to ignore. And quiet enough to survive for years without being seen. The German Democratic Republic did not rely on a single dramatic lie. It relied on a quiet method. Turning citizens into paperwork. Then using paperwork to shape citizens. When the archives were measured after reunification, they extended over more than 111 kilometers of files. Laid side by side, they would stretch farther than the distance between Berlin and Leipzig. Each folder small. Each life ordinary. Together, infrastructure. 3 centimeters multiplied by millions does not create fear. It creates administration. And administration, once visible, is difficult to defend. 3 centimeters. A small weight. Enough to bend a life.